Welcome, engineers. My name is Travis IQ, and you need to learn Web3. Even if you're InfoSec, CyberSec, offensive, red team, blue team, purple, whatever it is. Web3, let's do it. So what have we talked about to this point on this channel? We've talked a lot about cybersecurity and networking, cybersec and networking, but we've also touched on a lot of crypto, I guess what you would say crypto topics. So I've got videos on Bitcoin custodying, Bitcoin purchasing. We've got some videos on Solana, NFTs, rug pulls, these types of things. And really this all falls under the category of Web3. I had a developer ask me the other day, Travis, what is Web3? I actually wrote an interesting Twitter thread on this as well. Web3 is the intersection of traditional web, what people nowadays would call Web 2 in the last couple of years, and the intersection of Web 2 and decentralized infrastructures. Decentralized infrastructures. And what lives here? Let me give you an example of an intersection between Web 2 and an equivalent decentralized infrastructure technology. So there's something that we've talked about on here as well from a traditional networking standpoint, and that's DNS, the domain name service. And what does DNS do? DNS maps IP addresses to human readable domain names. That's what it does. What's an equivalent technology in the decentralized crypto blockchain world? And you might have actually seen this if you've seen any news about this or things like this. It's called ENS. It's an Ethereum name service. And so if you've seen any of the previous videos when I talked about public key, private key, right? The public keys that are displayed for these layer ones, Solana, Ethereum, Bitcoin, they all display as not readable things. This is what it was before DNS as well, right? They were IP addresses. They were 32-bit addresses that were represented as 8-bit octets, base 10 octets. How do we represent a public key more clearly? So pub key, domain, a human readable domain. And in this case, they are .eth domains. That's what you see a lot on like some of these Twitter handles for people who are part of the Ethereum name service. You may have seen this because ENS actually dropped a native token, and a bunch of people received native token for registering .eth domains. So this is an equivalent technology in a decentralized infrastructure. We have public keys that we need to sign transactions and whatnot. If you want more information about that, go back and watch the Bitcoin video. And we can now register a .eth domain, say Travis IQ, whoops, not with a dot, whatever, iq.eth. And I can then associate that name with a public key that I also own, a public key private key pair. So I'll associate it with the public key because I own the private key for an Ethereum wallet. And then I can do all sorts of things. The most common is payment, right, where you can use the Ethereum wallet address, a .eth domain name instead of an Ethereum wallet address. So you can make these things a lot easier. If you think about this, for those of you that have been around this space networking long enough, and you remember when IP addresses were domainless, now it's starting to make sense as to why these services are starting to evolve for this infrastructure. It starts to compute as to how nascent this industry is. There is a lot of weird things going on from an NFT perspective, from a layer one perspective with multiple chains dropping layer ones and venture capitalists putting out all this stuff. It doesn't really matter, right? What I'm talking about is the tech, right? Why Web 2 and Web 3 are so interrelated, and why we as networking infrastructure people, as cybersecurity folk, in just a second when I get to this, should be more equipped to understand this, and why we should be attempting to understand it more than we already are, probably. At least a lot of the folks in my timeline aren't spending a lot of time doing this. So here's an example of Web3 infrastructure. There's other things here, right? Obviously, you can use it for, let's clear this off. So what else can we do in what is a Web3 equivalent? What payments? Online payments. So you can think of something as, why do I need Web3 for payments when I can use something like PayPal, for example? Well, there's some pretty cool advantages from like a financial standpoint, from a fees standpoint, things like this. There's some things to incentivize it, but there are companies that are building on the Web3 infrastructure to facilitate, right, fast, immutable payments with lower fees, with more finality and all these things. Now, that's not necessarily what I'm telling you to get into, but there's another example. How about things like something that actually really stuck with me when I first got into the space was data quality, for example. You ever think about something like this, for example, data quality? In the Web3 world, they call these data oracles. And so these are providing quality data to things like the Web3 infrastructure when you're doing like fast, immutable payments and like non-reversible. So you're not as concerned with the quality of the data, at least not as concerned with the quality of the data when payments are reversible, right? When something gets screwed up in the banking system and the stuff clears over days and days, then you're not really as worried about this, right? But in the Web3 world, where these things clear instantaneously and are irreversible because they are immutable on the blockchain, right? The quality of the data that you're acting on, if you're saying, hey, when I hit this price target, or when this amount of rain falls, or when this score for a game hits for a bet or something like that, that you need to make sure that that's actually a definitive source of truth. For example, you might be familiar with sources of truth when you do things like network programmability. All of this stuff is more understandable, is less unique to Web3 when you're considering where you're coming from like a networking and cybersecurity space. Why are we also more familiar with this? We should all be familiar with things like PKI, the public key infrastructure. We should be familiar with things like digital signatures. If you've heard anything about the new Bitcoin updates, which was Taproot, they actually changed the digital signature algorithm. This was a big deal for a number of reasons. And you're like, Travis, that's pretty interesting, right? The application of digital signatures to a different industry, although it's something that I'm very familiar with because I understand cryptography to some extent, right? Depending upon what part of the industry you're in. Then this, right? And the updates to this in a new infrastructure, in a new Web3 infrastructure, should actually interest you a whole lot. And you should be well equipped with the fundamental knowledge to really understand this stuff. Okay, so here's another example. So there are examples of services that provision data for consumption, right? An example of this would be a utility called Chainlink. And they link data from the real world into this new Web3 infrastructure. They provide quality data and incentivize data quality, which is pretty cool, right? So these are all of these things that we need to start learning about in the Web3 infrastructure. One of the things that I found particularly interesting, and you've seen me talk about it on this channel from a Solana perspective, right, is NFT minting. And so I've been involved in some of this production process here, right? So NFT minting, right, is making NFTs and then placing their identifier, their ownership identifier, right, this token on the blockchain associated with an image or with whatever it is that you're trying to produce, right? And so there's this Web 2 front end that you still have to build, right, to allow, right, a mint, for example, mint button, and then when you click this, it interacts with a Web 3 infrastructure to mint the token ID, and then send it to the correct public key and sign it with the transaction the public key of the transaction of the original transactor and whatnot, right? So now it gets sent to where it needs to go. So you've got this Web 2 front end interacting with this Web 3 back end for something as interesting, or as, would you say, maybe as trivial as making a JPEG and sending it to somebody else, right? Whatever your views are on that type of stuff. So this is the intersection, again, between Web 2 and Web 3. This is why we need these things, and this is why you are more well-equipped than the rest of the world, to understand these types of things, which is pretty darn cool. And I'm going to leave you with my standard sign-off. Engineer, break stuff, have fun, let's go.